You're in the wrong section, sweetheart. Coach is in the back, where you belong.
The words cut through the pristine first-class cabin of Elite Airways Flight 901 like a blade through silk. They came from Jonathan Blackwood, a man whose $8,000 tailored suit cost more than most people made in 3 months, whose voice carried the absolute certainty of someone who had never been told no in his 52 years of life. Before we dive into this incredible true story, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been judged by your appearance only to shock everyone when they discovered who you really were? Drop your experience in the comments below. And if stories of justice and truth inspire you, make sure to hit that subscribe button and share this video, because what you're about to witness will change how you think about power prejudice and the price of underestimating someone. Now, let's step aboard Elite Airways Flight 901 departing Las Vegas at 2:45 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon that would reshape everything. The target of Blackwood's contempt was Zara Mitchell, 23 years old, sitting quietly in seat 1A with a Stanford University hoodie, faded jeans, and a worn backpack at her feet. She looked exactly like what she appeared to be, a graduate student heading home after an academic conference tired from 3 days of presentations and networking events. Her boarding pass was legitimate. Her demeanor was calm. But to Jonathan Blackwood, those details didn't matter. What mattered was that she was occupying his seat. Jonathan Blackwood wasn't just any passenger. He was the host of Blackwood Business Hour, a financial program with 2.4 million devoted followers who hung on his every word about success failure and what he called the hard truths about making it in America. His net worth of $2.3 billion had been earned through venture capital investments, and more recently, hostile takeovers of companies he deemed underperforming. He was flying to Phoenix to keynote the Western Business Summit, where 5,000 entrepreneurs would pay $500 each just to hear him speak. And right now, a young black woman in student clothes was sitting in what he considered his rightful place. "Excuse me," Blackwood said, his voice carrying that particular tone of barely controlled irritation that successful men use when the world doesn't immediately bend to their will. "There's been some kind of mistake." Zara looked up from her book, a thick economics textbook filled with highlighted passages and handwritten notes in the margins. Her expression remained neutral, polite. "I'm sorry." "That's my seat," Blackwood said, gesturing with his Platinum Elite Airways membership card. 1A. I always sit in 1A. Sophia Martinez, the flight attendant, appeared with the nervous energy of someone caught between two immovable forces. At 29, she had been with Elite Airways for 6 years, long enough to recognize the VIP passengers who could make or break her performance reviews. Blackwood was definitely one of them. His elite status meant priority boarding, complimentary upgrades, and the kind of customer loyalty that airlines killed for. "Let me check the manifest," Sophia said, her accent carrying the slightest tremor. She pulled out her tablet, fingers flying across the screen, while other first-class passengers began to take notice. Dr. James Wesley, a retired surgeon in his 60s, lowered his newspaper. Margaret Thornfield, an investment banker with sharp eyes and sharper instincts, paused her phone conversation. 2 other business travelers returning from a Las Vegas conference turned to watch the developing drama. According to the system, Sophia said carefully, "Miss Mitchell has a confirmed first-class ticket for seat 1A. Blackwood's jaw tightened. "Run it again." Zara remained seated, her book still open, but her attention now fully focused on the unfolding situation. She had experienced moments like this before, moments when her presence in certain spaces was questioned, challenged, or dismissed entirely. But this felt different, more public, more deliberate. "Sir, I can offer you seat 1B, Sophia said, attempting diplomacy. "It's identical accommodation with the same service level." "That's not the point," Blackwood said, his voice rising just enough for everyone in the cabin to hear clearly. "I have elite platinum status. I've been flying Elite Airways for 15 years. That seat," he pointed directly at Zara, "should automatically be mine." The cabin fell silent except for the steady hum of engines and air circulation. Other passengers were no longer pretending to mind their own business. Phone cameras remained holstered, but attention was completely focused on the confrontation developing in row 1. Zara closed her book, deliberately placed it on her lap, and looked directly at Jonathan Blackwood. "I have a confirmed ticket for this seat," she said calmly. "I checked in online, selected my preference, and paid the fare difference." "Really?" Blackwood's tone shifted, taking on the condescending edge he used on his show when interviewing guests he considered intellectually beneath him. "And how exactly does a student afford first-class tickets? Let me guess, scholarship money. Financial aid that was meant for books and housing." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Margaret Thornfield raised an eyebrow, her professional instincts recognizing the legal and public relations landmine that Blackwood had just stepped on. Dr. Wesley shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Sophia looked pale, realizing that this situation was escalating far beyond a simple seating dispute. Zara's expression didn't change. She had learned long ago that reacting to prejudice with emotion only gave others ammunition to use against her. Instead, she reached into her backpack and pulled out her boarding pass, holding it up so everyone could see. "This ticket was purchased with my personal credit card," she said evenly. "I can show you the receipt if you'd like verification." Blackwood laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Personal credit card, sweetheart? Do you have any idea what first-class tickets cost? We're talking about more money than most students see in a semester." The conversation had crossed a line and everyone in the cabin knew it. But Blackwood was just getting started. His confidence came from years of being right, of having his assumptions validated by success and status. He had built an empire by reading people correctly, by understanding who had real power and who was just pretending. Looking at Zara Mitchell, he saw exactly what he expected to see a young woman playing above her league, probably using borrowed money or financial aid to experience a luxury she couldn't actually afford. In his world, people who belonged in first class looked like him, talked like him, and had bank accounts that justified their presence. "You know what Blackwood said, pulling out his phone? This is exactly the kind of entitled behavior I talk about on my show. People thinking they deserve things they haven't earned, taking advantage of systems designed to help them get ahead." He began typing on his phone, crafting what would become one of the most regrettable social media posts of his career. Other passengers watched in fascination and growing discomfort as a successful businessman prepared to publicly humiliate a young woman whose only crime was sitting in a seat she had legally purchased. Sophia made one final attempt at de-escalation. "Mister Blackwood, perhaps we could discuss alternative arrangements that would satisfy everyone." But Blackwood was no longer interested in alternative arrangements. He was interested in making a point and asserting the natural order that had served him so well for so many years. He had built his brand on telling uncomfortable truths, on calling out behavior that he saw as destructive to American values of hard work and earned success. Looking at Zara Mitchell, he saw an opportunity to teach a lesson, and that's exactly when everything began to fall apart. "Tell you what," Blackwood said, his voice carrying the confident tone of someone delivering a crushing argument. "Why don't you show me your bank statement? Prove that you can actually afford to be sitting here. Because I'm willing to bet that seat cost more than you make in 6 months." The request was inappropriate, potentially illegal, and definitely revealing. Dr. Wesley cleared his throat, preparing to intervene. Margaret Thornfield's finger hovered over her phone's record button. Sophia looked desperately toward the cockpit, hoping for backup from the captain. And Zara Mitchell smiled. It wasn't a big smile, nothing dramatic or triumphant, just a small knowing expression that suggested she had been expecting this moment all along. She reached into her backpack again, not for her wallet or bank statements, but for her phone. "I think," she said quietly, "it's time to make a phone call." As Zara dialed a number stored in her contacts under legal team, the other passengers remained frozen in their seats, uncertain whether they were witnessing a student's desperate bluff or something far more complex. The call connected immediately despite the early hour in California. "Mitchell Legal Services, this is Catherine speaking." "Catherine, this is Zara. I need you to prepare Protocol 7 documentation for Elite Airways Flight 901. We have a discrimination incident in progress." The conversation was brief, professional, and conducted in a tone that made Margaret Thornfield's investment banking instincts suddenly come alive. Students didn't have legal teams on speed dial. Students didn't use phrases like discrimination incident or reference-numbered protocols. While Zara spoke quietly into her phone, the story behind this confrontation was far more complex than anyone in that cabin could have imagined. 3 years earlier, Zara Mitchell had inherited something that would change her life forever: controlling interest in Elite Airways acquired through a complex trust fund established by her grandfather, William Mitchell. William had been a civil rights lawyer who invested wisely in transportation companies during the deregulation era of the 1980s. When he died, his fortune passed to his only granddaughter, along with explicit instructions about how to use inherited wealth responsibly. The inheritance came with conditions. Zara could not simply cash out and walk away. She was required to actively oversee the companies in which she held stakes to ensure they operated according to principles of fairness and equal treatment. If she discovered evidence of discrimination or bias, she had the authority and obligation to implement immediate reforms. For the past 18 months, Zara had been doing exactly that. She flew Elite Airways routes regularly, sometimes in coach, sometimes in business class, occasionally in first class, always dressed as an ordinary passenger. She had documented dozens of incidents where minority passengers were treated differently than white passengers, where assumptions about wealth and status led to unequal service, where company policies were applied selectively based on appearance and accent. Today's flight was supposed to be routine surveillance, a quick trip from Las Vegas back to Stanford, where she was genuinely enrolled in a PhD economics program. She had chosen first class specifically to test how Elite Airways staff handled minority passengers in premium cabins. The plan was simple: observe, document, and report findings to the board of directors through her proxy representative. She had not expected to encounter Jonathan Blackwood. While Zara finished her phone call, Blackwood was conducting his own research. He had pulled up her Facebook profile, scrolled through her Instagram posts, and confirmed his initial assessment: graduate student, probably working class background, definitely someone who didn't belong in first class without some kind of assistance or windfall. "Interesting," he said loudly enough for other passengers to hear. "Your social media shows a lot of student life, library sessions, campus events. Not exactly the lifestyle of someone who regularly flies first class." Dr. Wesley had heard enough. "Excuse me," he said, addressing Blackwood directly. "This young woman has shown her ticket. She's behaving politely and hasn't disrupted anyone. Perhaps we should all focus on our own affairs." Blackwood turned his attention to the retired surgeon with the dismissive look he reserved for people who didn't understand how the world really worked. "Doctor, I appreciate your concern, but this is about principle. Airlines have spending thresholds for premium services. When people game the system, it hurts everyone who follows the rules." Margaret Thornfield, who had been quietly observing the entire exchange, finally spoke up. "What system exactly is being gamed? She bought a ticket, she's sitting in her assigned seat, and she's causing no trouble whatsoever." "The system of earned privilege," Blackwood replied confidently. "First class exists for people who can afford it without financial strain, who contribute to the airline's profitability through consistent business travel. Not for students having a once-in-a-lifetime experience on borrowed money." The conversation had attracted the attention of Captain Luis Rodriguez, who emerged from the cockpit to assess the growing disruption. At 45, Rodriguez had been flying for Elite Airways for 20 years, long enough to recognize when passenger conflicts threatened flight safety and schedule adherence. "Is there a problem here?" he asked Sophia, who looked relieved to have backup. "Seating dispute, Captain," she replied quietly. "Mr. Blackwood questions the validity of Miss Mitchell's first-class ticket." Rodriguez glanced at his watch. They were already 15 minutes behind their departure time, and further delays would cascade through the entire afternoon schedule. His training emphasized swift resolution of passenger conflicts with particular deference to high-value customers who generated significant revenue. "Miss Mitchell," he said politely, Would you be willing to accept a complimentary upgrade to first class on your next Elite Airways flight? In exchange for moving to a coach seat today, we'll provide full meal service and priority deplaning. The offer was reasonable from an operational perspective, designed to appease the VIP passenger while providing compensation for the inconvenience. But it was also exactly the kind of capitulation that Zara had been documenting throughout her 18 months of undercover evaluation. "Captain," she said calmly, "I have a confirmed first-class ticket that I purchased with my own money. Why should I accept a lesser seat because another passenger doesn't think I belong here?" The question hung in the air, forcing everyone to confront the ugly truth at the center of the confrontation. This wasn't about seating logistics or airline policies. This was about assumptions based on appearance, about who was allowed to occupy certain spaces without justification. Blackwood, sensing an opportunity to demonstrate his business acumen, decided to escalate. "Captain, I fly Elite Airways exclusively for business travel. My company books approximately 200 flights per year through your airline. Miss Mitchell is clearly a student who saved up for one first-class experience. From a customer value perspective, the choice should be obvious." The mathematics of airline profitability supported Blackwood's argument. Business travelers like him generated significantly more revenue than occasional leisure passengers. Airlines had built their entire industry around prioritizing frequent flyers, corporate accounts, and passengers who booked last-minute flights at premium prices. But Captain Rodriguez also recognized the legal implications of removing a passenger based solely on another customer's complaints about their appearance or perceived economic status. Elite Airways had recently settled several discrimination lawsuits, and corporate headquarters had emphasized the importance of treating all confirmed passengers equally. Mr. Blackwood Rodriguez said carefully, "Both passengers have valid tickets. Company policy requires us to honor confirmed reservations regardless of customer status or spending history." Blackwood's confidence never wavered. "Then let me make this simple," he said, pulling out his phone again. "I'm going to document this entire situation for my followers. 2.4 million people who trust my judgment about business practices and customer service standards." He began recording a video, speaking directly to his phone camera, while Zara sat silently in the background. "This is exactly what I talk about in my seminars. Entitlement culture has reached the point where students think they deserve first-class accommodations without earning them. Airlines that enable this behavior are destroying the value proposition for business travelers who actually generate revenue." The video was posted immediately to his social media accounts, complete with hashtags about entitled millennials and declining service standards. Within minutes, it began generating likes, shares, and comments from his devoted followers, who shared his perspective on earned privilege and social hierarchy. Margaret Thornfield, who understood social media dynamics from her work in corporate communications, realized that Blackwood had just created a public relations nightmare for himself. Corporate discrimination lawsuits were expensive, but viral videos of wealthy businessmen humiliating young minority passengers were career-ending. "Mr. Blackwood," she said quietly, "you might want to reconsider that post." But Blackwood was riding high on the adrenaline of being right, of standing up for principles that had served him well throughout his career. He had built his brand on fearlessly confronting uncomfortable truths, and this situation perfectly illustrated everything wrong with modern entitlement culture. What he didn't know was that Zara Mitchell had just finished a very different phone call, one that would reshape his understanding of power privilege and the price of making assumptions. Sophia Zara said calmly, "Could you please ask your ground operations manager to call this flight? I believe there's been some confusion about passenger manifests that needs immediate clarification." The request was oddly specific, delivered with a confidence that made Sophia pause. Students didn't typically know about ground operations managers or manifest procedures. But before she could respond, her phone rang. The caller ID showed Elena Santos, Elite Airways Customer Service Manager at McCarran International Airport in Las Vegas. "Sophia, this is Elena. We have an urgent situation regarding Flight 901. I need to speak with the captain immediately." As Sophia handed the phone to Captain Rodriguez, Zara Mitchell sat quietly in seat 1A, her economics textbook open to a chapter about corporate governance and stakeholder theory. She had read that chapter dozens of times, not just as a student, but as someone who would soon be making decisions that affected thousands of employees and millions of passengers. The phone call between Elena Santos and Captain Rodriguez lasted exactly 90 seconds. When it ended, Rodriguez's expression had completely changed. He stared at Zara Mitchell with something approaching disbelief, then turned to Sophia with instructions that would reshape everything. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced over the cabin intercom, "we're going to have a brief delay while we resolve a passenger services issue. Thank you for your patience." But Blackwood, still riding high on his social media success, wasn't finished making his point about earned privilege and entitled behavior. He had no idea that his carefully constructed argument was about to collide with a truth that would destroy everything he thought he understood about power. The collision was about to begin. Jonathan Blackwood's social media post had been live for exactly 7 minutes when it began generating the kind of engagement that public relations experts have nightmares about. His followers, loyal and vocal, were sharing the video with comments that ranged from supportive to explicitly racist, creating a viral moment that was about to spiral completely out of control. "Look at this response," Blackwood said triumphantly, showing his phone to Dr. Wesley and Margaret Thornfield. 12,000 views already. People understand what's happening here. They recognize entitlement when they see it. Margaret, whose investment banking background had taught her to recognize impending disasters, looked at the comment section with growing alarm. While some followers supported Blackwood's position, others were making the kind of statements that would attract attention from lawyers, journalists, and corporate risk management teams. "That girl thinks she owns the plane," read one comment that already had 300 likes. "Students using our tax dollars to live like rich people," added another. "Send her back to coach where she belongs," concluded a third, accompanied by emojis that violated most social media platforms' terms of service. Dr. Wesley, who had remained silent during most of the confrontation, finally stood up. "Mr. Blackwood, this has gone far enough. You're publicly humiliating a young woman who has done nothing wrong." Blackwood turned his attention to the retired surgeon with the condescending smile he used on television when interviewing guests who disagreed with his positions. "Doctor, I understand your concern, but sometimes uncomfortable truths need to be spoken. This young lady is experiencing lifestyle inflation funded by debt or assistance programs. Enabling that behavior doesn't help anyone." Zara, who had been quietly observing the escalating confrontation while taking mental notes about every aspect of the situation, finally closed her textbook and looked directly at Blackwood. "Mr. Blackwood," she said calmly, "you seem very concerned about how I paid for this ticket. Would you like to see my credit card statement?" The offer surprised him. Most people confronted with financial scrutiny would become defensive or emotional, but Zara's tone remained level, almost curious about his response. "Actually, yes," he said confidently. "I think transparency would benefit everyone here." Zara reached into her backpack and pulled out her phone, scrolling through her banking app with deliberate precision. "Here's the charge from yesterday. First-class ticket Las Vegas to Phoenix purchased with my personal American Express Black Card." She held the phone screen toward Blackwood, who leaned forward to examine the transaction details. The charge was legitimate. $847 for a first-class ticket on Elite Airways Flight 901. But what caught his attention was something else entirely. The account balance visible at the top of the screen showed a number with more digits than most people see in their lifetime. Blackwood's confident expression flickered for just a moment. "Well," he said, "recovering quickly, anyone can accumulate debt on a credit card. The question is whether you can actually pay for it without assistance." Margaret Thornfield, who processed high-net-worth financial statements, regularly had caught a glimpse of the banking app over Blackwood's shoulder. The number she saw didn't represent debt. It represented liquid assets that exceeded the annual revenue of most Fortune 500 companies. "Zara," she said carefully, "may I ask what you study at Stanford Economics?" Zara replied with a focus on corporate governance and stakeholder theory. My dissertation research examines how transportation companies balance profit maximization with social responsibility. The response was academically precise, but it also contained details that made Margaret's professional instincts start firing on all cylinders. Doctoral students didn't typically research corporate governance unless they had access to real-world case studies and insider information. And stakeholder theory wasn't just academic research, it was the foundation of modern business ethics training for executives and board members. Dr. Wesley, who had been watching the entire exchange with growing discomfort, decided to intervene more directly. Mr. Blackwood, regardless of this young woman's financial situation, your behavior has been inappropriate and potentially discriminatory. I suggest we all return to our seats and allow the crew to prepare for departure. But Blackwood was too committed to his position to back down now. His social media followers were watching. His reputation for fearless truth-telling was on the line, and he genuinely believed he was exposing the kind of widespread fraud that undermined legitimate business travelers. I'm not backing down from this, he declared loudly enough for the entire first-class cabin to hear. Someone needs to hold the line against entitlement culture. If airlines don't verify that first-class passengers can actually afford the premium they're paying, the whole system breaks down. Sophia Martinez, who had been growing increasingly uncomfortable with the escalating confrontation, made a decision that would define the rest of her career. Instead of continuing to mediate between two passengers, she picked up the cabin phone and called ground operations directly. Elena, this is Sophia on Flight 901. We have a situation that needs immediate escalation to corporate management. A passenger is being accused of fraud based on his racial profiling, and the situation is being live-streamed on social media. Elena Santos, Elite Airways customer service manager, had been monitoring the situation since receiving the call from Zara Mitchell's legal team 20 minutes earlier. What she discovered in the passenger manifest had sent shockwaves through the corporate offices in Chicago and prompted emergency calls to the airline's CEO and legal department. Sophia Elena said carefully, I need to speak directly with Miss Zara Mitchell. Transfer the call to her immediately. The request was unusual. Customer service managers didn't typically request direct communication with passengers during flight boarding. But Sophia, sensing that forces beyond her understanding were now in motion, handed her phone directly to Zara. The conversation that followed lasted exactly 45 seconds. When it ended, Zara returned the phone to Sophia with a small smile that somehow managed to be both grateful and ominous. Thank you, Elena, she said. Please proceed with standard protocols. Standard protocols, as it turned out, meant that Elite Airways Flight 901 was about to experience the most dramatic passenger confrontation in the airline's 40-year history. Captain Rodriguez, who had been monitoring the situation from the cockpit while completing pre-flight procedures, emerged again to address the growing chaos in his cabin. The delay was approaching 30 minutes, which meant potential cascading effects on afternoon and evening flights throughout the Elite Airways system. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced, I apologize for the continued delay. We're resolving a passenger verification issue that requires consultation with corporate headquarters. Blackwood, who interpreted this announcement as validation of his concerns about Zara's legitimacy, pulled out his phone to record another video for his followers. Update from Elite Airways Flight 901, he said directly to his camera. The crew is now investigating the passenger I identified, which suggests my concerns were justified. Corporate verification procedures exist for a reason, and airlines that ignore them are failing their legitimate customers. The second video generated even more engagement than the first, attracting attention from aviation bloggers, travel journalists, and social media influencers who specialized in exposing corporate incompetence. Within an hour, Elite Airways scandal was trending on 3 major platforms, though not for the reasons Blackwood expected. Margaret Thornfield, who had been discreetly researching Zara Mitchell's background on her phone, suddenly went very pale. Her LinkedIn investigation had revealed something that completely reframed everything she had witnessed over the past 30 minutes. "Oh my God," she whispered to Dr. Wesley, showing him her phone screen. Dr. Wesley read the information twice before looking up at Zara with an expression of profound realization. "You're not just a student, are you?" Zara's response was interrupted by Sophia's phone ringing again. This time, the call was from Captain Rodriguez's direct supervisor, Elite Airways Regional Operations Director Michael Chen, calling from the corporate headquarters in Chicago. Captain Rodriguez Chen's voice was tight with barely controlled panic. "You need to resolve the situation on Flight 901 immediately. We have legal teams activating, public relations disasters developing, and board members asking very difficult questions. Whatever is happening in that cabin needs to stop now." Rodriguez, a 20-year veteran who had never received a call like this from corporate headquarters, realized that he was dealing with forces far beyond typical passenger disputes. "What exactly am I dealing with here?" he asked Chen directly. "You're dealing with someone who can end your career and shut down this entire airline with a single phone call," Chen replied. "Treat Miss Mitchell with the respect and courtesy that our most valued customers deserve, and pray that the damage can still be contained." As Captain Rodriguez processed this information, Jonathan Blackwood was preparing to deliver what he believed would be the decisive blow in his campaign against entitlement culture and fraudulent first-class passengers. He had no idea that he was about to discover just how catastrophically wrong his assumptions had been. The revelation was less than 2 minutes away, and when it came, it would destroy everything he thought he knew about power privilege and the young woman sitting quietly in seat 1A. But first, Margaret Thornfield was going to share what she had discovered in her research, and that information was going to change everything. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who processed million-dollar transactions daily, "I think you need to see something before you say another word." She held up her phone, displaying a Forbes article titled "America's Youngest Transportation Billionaires: The Hidden Power Behind Elite Airways." The photograph accompanying the article showed Zara Mitchell accepting an industry leadership award at a transportation conference in Dallas 6 months earlier. She was wearing the same Stanford University hoodie she had on today, but she was also shaking hands with the Secretary of Transportation and standing next to a banner identifying her as the majority stakeholder in Elite Airways Holdings Group. Jonathan Blackwood stared at the image for exactly 5 seconds before the full magnitude of his mistake became clear. He had just spent 30 minutes publicly humiliating, recording, and attempting to remove the owner of the airline from her own first-class cabin, and his 2.4 million social media followers had watched him do it. The silence that followed Margaret Thornfield's revelation lasted exactly 12 seconds, but those 12 seconds contained a lifetime of realization horror and the complete destruction of Jonathan Blackwood's carefully constructed worldview. He stared at the Forbes article, reading the headline 3 times, examining the photograph with the desperate hope that he was somehow mistaken. But there was no mistake. The young woman in the Stanford hoodie accepting an industry leadership award was unmistakably the same person sitting in seat 1A, the person he had just spent half an hour publicly humiliating in front of millions of social media followers. "This can't be right," he said, his voice lacking the confidence that had defined every word he'd spoken since boarding. "This has to be some kind of mistake or coincidence." Dr. Wesley leaned over to examine the article more closely. The details were specific and verifiable. Zara Mitchell, age 23, had inherited controlling interest in Elite Airways through the William Mitchell Trust Fund following her grandfather's death 3 years earlier. The trust held significant stakes in 12 transportation companies, making her one of the youngest billionaires in American corporate history. Margaret Thornfield, whose investment banking background had taught her to verify information sources, pulled up additional articles from the Wall Street Journal, Business Week, and Transportation Today. Every source confirmed the same basic facts. Zara Mitchell owned Elite Airways, had been actively involved in corporate governance decisions, and had recently implemented new policies regarding customer service and employee training. "She's been flying undercover," Margaret said, the pieces clicking together in her mind. The casual clothes, the student appearance, the research about corporate governance and stakeholder theory. She's been evaluating her own company from the customer perspective. Blackwood's phone began buzzing with notifications as his earlier videos continued generating engagement, but now the comment section was taking a dramatically different tone. His followers had discovered the same Forbes articles that Margaret had found, and they were beginning to realize that their business hero had just committed career suicide on live video. "Delete the posts," Dr. Wesley said urgently. "Delete them now before this gets any worse." But it was already too late. Screenshots of Blackwood's videos had been captured and shared across multiple platforms. Aviation industry blogs were picking up the story. Reporters who specialized in corporate scandals were making phone calls. And somewhere in Elite Airways' corporate headquarters, lawyers were preparing damage control strategies for what would become one of the most expensive public relations disasters in airline history. Sophia Martinez, who had been standing frozen near the galley while processing the implications of what she had just learned, made a decision that would define the rest of her career. She walked directly to Zara's seat, looked her in the eyes, and said something that no flight attendant had ever said to a passenger in the 40-year history of Elite Airways. "Ma'am, I need to formally apologize for the service failure you've experienced on your own airline. This situation never should have escalated, and I take personal responsibility for not intervening more effectively." The apology was professional, direct, and completely inappropriate according to standard airline customer service protocols. Flight attendants were trained to remain neutral during passenger disputes to avoid taking sides or accepting blame for situations beyond their control. But Sophia recognized that standard protocols didn't apply when your boss was being discriminated against in her own first-class cabin. Zara's response surprised everyone who had been watching her maintain perfect composure throughout the entire confrontation. "Sophia," she said gently, "you handled an impossible situation with grace and professionalism. This incident isn't about your performance. It's about company policies that prioritize customer spending over customer dignity." The conversation was interrupted by Captain Rodriguez's phone, which rang with the distinctive tone reserved for emergency communications from air traffic control or corporate headquarters. He answered immediately, recognizing the number of Elite Airways CEO Patricia Hamilton calling directly from Chicago. "Captain Rodriguez, this is Patricia Hamilton. I need you to understand that you have the owner of this airline sitting in your first-class cabin, and according to our legal team, she has been subjected to discrimination that could result in federal investigations and lawsuits that would bankrupt this company." Rodriguez, who had been flying commercial aircraft for 25 years, had never received a phone call like this. CEOs didn't personally intervene in passenger disputes unless the situation posed existential threats to corporate survival. "What exactly am I supposed to do here?" he asked quietly. "You're supposed to treat Miss Mitchell with the respect and courtesy that any passenger deserves regardless of their ownership stake," Hamilton replied. "But you're also supposed to document everything that happened so our legal team can assess liability and our public relations team can control the narrative before this story destroys us." As Captain Rodriguez processed instructions from corporate headquarters, Zara Mitchell was making a phone call that would determine how the next phase of this confrontation would unfold. She dialed a number stored in her contacts under Board Secretary and waited for Catherine Wright to answer. "Catherine, this is Zara. I'm implementing Protocol 7 on Elite Airways Flight 901. I need you to conference in Patricia Hamilton and the legal team for an emergency board action." Protocol 7, as Catherine Wright knew from her 5 years as board secretary for Elite Airways Holdings Group, was reserved for situations involving documented discrimination against company stakeholders or widespread violations of federal civil rights laws. It authorized immediate implementation of disciplinary actions, policy changes, and legal responses designed to protect the company from liability, while ensuring appropriate consequences for discriminatory behavior. The conference call that followed included Zara CEO Patricia Hamilton, legal counsel James Morrison, and public relations director Sandra Chen speaking from Elite Airways headquarters. while dozens of first-class passengers and crew members listened to one side of a conversation that would reshape company policy forever. Patricia Zara said calmly, "I need a statement issued within the next 15 minutes, acknowledging that Elite Airways does not tolerate discrimination against passengers based on race, age, or perceived economic status. I need immediate suspension of any employee who prioritized customer spending over customer rights. And I need a comprehensive review of VIP passenger policies that enable this kind of behavior." The requests were delivered in the same tone Zara had used throughout the confrontation, professional and measured, but they carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Jonathan Blackwood, who had been listening to this conversation with growing horror, finally understood the full magnitude of his mistake. He hadn't just humiliated a student who happened to be wealthy. He had publicly attacked the owner of a major corporation, documented his discrimination on social media, and created a viral moment that would follow him for the rest of his career. "This is impossible," he said, though his voice lacked any conviction. "Students don't own airlines. Young people don't have that kind of wealth or authority." Margaret Thornfield, who processed high-net-worth estate transfers regularly, looked at him with something approaching pity. "Mr. Blackwood, inheritance law doesn't have age restrictions. When William Mitchell died, his assets transferred to his designated heir according to legal documentation that was filed in federal court. The Forbes article includes details about the trust structure and governance requirements." Dr. Wesley, who had remained silent while processing the implications of everything he had witnessed, finally addressed Jonathan Blackwood directly. "Jonathan," he said, using his first name deliberately, "you built your entire brand on understanding power dynamics and business relationships. How did you so completely misread this situation?" The question struck at the heart of Blackwood's professional identity. His television show, his books, his seminars, his social media, following everything, was built on his ability to accurately assess people's situations and opportunities. His followers trusted his judgment precisely because he had demonstrated consistent success in reading complex business dynamics. But looking at Zara Mitchell, he had seen exactly what his assumptions had told him to see: a young black woman in student clothes who didn't belong in first class. His worldview had no category for young minority billionaires who dressed casually and conducted business quietly. "I made reasonable assumptions based on available information," he said, but even he could hear how weak the defense sounded. "You made racist assumptions based on appearance," Margaret corrected. "And you documented those assumptions on social media for millions of people to witness." As this conversation continued, Sofia Martinez was receiving rapid-fire instructions from Elena Santos, who was coordinating damage control efforts from the Ground Operations Center. Elite Airways' stock price had already dropped 3% in after-hours trading as news of the incident spread through financial networks. Corporate headquarters was activating crisis management protocols that hadn't been used since the September 11th attacks. Sofia Elena said urgently, "I need you to offer Miss Mitchell anything she requests. Meal service, beverage preferences, seat adjustments, deplaning assistance, future travel accommodations, anything at all. The legal team is terrified that she's going to file discrimination lawsuits that could cost us hundreds of millions in settlements and federal penalties." But Zara wasn't thinking about lawsuits or settlements. She was thinking about the 18 months she had spent documenting incidents exactly like this one, collecting evidence of how Elite Airways employees treated minority passengers differently than white passengers, building a case for comprehensive policy reform that would prevent future discrimination. Today's incident wasn't an anomaly. It was a perfect example of problems that existed throughout the company culture, problems that could only be solved through leadership, accountability, and structural change. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Rodriguez announced over the cabin intercom, "I've just received clearance for immediate departure. However, I want to personally apologize for the service disruption you've experienced today, and I want to assure you that Elite Airways is committed to treating every passenger with dignity and respect, regardless of their background or appearance." The announcement was carefully worded to acknowledge the problem without accepting legal liability, but it also served as public recognition that something significant had gone wrong in the first-class cabin. As Flight 901 finally began taxiing toward the runway, Jonathan Blackwood sat in his seat with the growing realization that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't yet imagine. His phone continued buzzing with notifications as his social media posts generated millions of views, but the comments were no longer supportive. His followers were abandoning him in real time, corporate sponsors were distancing themselves from his brand, and business associates were quietly removing his contact information from their phones. Margaret Thornfield, who understood how quickly reputations could be destroyed in the digital age, leaned across the aisle to offer one final piece of advice. "Jonathan," she said quietly, "when we land, you need to hire the best crisis management team you can find, issue a public apology that actually acknowledges what you did wrong, and pray that Miss Mitchell is more forgiving than her legal team." But Blackwood was no longer listening to advice from fellow passengers. He was staring at his phone, watching his career dissolve in real time and trying to understand how 30 minutes of what he thought was principled truth-telling had become the most expensive mistake of his professional life. Zara Mitchell, meanwhile, was opening her economics textbook to a chapter about corporate social responsibility and the long-term costs of discriminatory business practices. She had work to do, and Flight 901 was just the beginning. The moment Elite Airways Flight 901 touched down at Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport, Zara Mitchell's phone began ringing with calls that would reshape the airline industry's approach to passenger discrimination. The first call came from Patricia Hamilton, Elite Airways CEO, who had spent the 90-minute flight coordinating with legal teams, public relations specialists, and board members to address what had become a company-threatening crisis. Zara Hamilton said without preamble, "We need to meet immediately. The legal team has identified 17 potential federal violations related to today's incident, and our stock price has dropped 8% since the video went viral." "How do you want to handle this?" Zara, who had spent the flight documenting every detail of her treatment while other passengers pretended not to stare, answered with the calm authority that had defined her response throughout the entire confrontation. "Patricia, I want a full investigation of passenger service protocols, immediate termination of any employee who prioritized customer spending over civil rights, and implementation of mandatory bias training for all customer-facing staff. This incident didn't happen in isolation. It represents failures that exist throughout our company culture." The conversation continued as passengers deplaned around them, but Margaret Thornfield and Dr. Wesley remained in their seats, quietly observing the resolution of the most dramatic airline incident they had ever witnessed. Jonathan Blackwood, meanwhile, sat frozen in row 2, staring at his phone as his professional life disintegrated in real time. His social media posts had been viewed more than 5 million times in the past 2 hours. Major news networks were running the story as breaking news. Business associates were calling to distance themselves from his brand, and his agent had left 3 voicemails informing him that speaking engagements worth more than $2 million had been canceled pending reputation assessment. Sophia Martinez, who had spent the flight contemplating her career prospects after failing to prevent a discrimination incident against her company's owner, approached Zara as other passengers collected their belongings. "Miss Mitchell," she said carefully, "I want to formally request a meeting with Human Resources to discuss how I could have handled this situation better. I recognize that my training was inadequate and my response was insufficient." Zara looked at Sophia with the same measured expression she had maintained throughout the confrontation, but her tone carried warmth that hadn't been present during the crisis. "Sophia, you were caught between impossible choices. A VIP passenger was making unreasonable demands, corporate policies prioritized his spending over passenger rights, and you had no training for handling discrimination incidents. This situation exposed widespread failures, not individual incompetence." The conversation was interrupted by Elena Santos, who had driven from McCarran International to Phoenix Sky Harbor to personally oversee the crisis management response. As Elite Airways customer service manager, Elena knew that her career depended on successfully containing the public relations disaster that had exploded across social media. Miss Mitchell, Elena said, approaching with the deference typically reserved for board members and federal regulators, "We have a crisis management team standing by to address media inquiries, legal representatives prepared to discuss potential settlements, and executive leadership ready to implement any policy changes you deem necessary." But Zara wasn't interested in damage control or settlement negotiations. She was interested in using this incident to implement reforms that would prevent future discrimination against passengers who couldn't defend themselves the way she had. "Elena," she said, "I want you to pull passenger complaint data for the past 24 months, focusing on incidents involving minority customers who were questioned about their ticket legitimacy, asked to provide additional documentation, or moved to different seats based on staff assumptions. I want patterns identified and responses documented." The request revealed the depth of Zara's knowledge about airline operations and her understanding of how discrimination typically functioned within corporate structures. She wasn't just responding to her own mistreatment. She was conducting a comprehensive audit of company practices that would reshape how Elite Airways treated all passengers. Captain Rodriguez, who had been completing post-flight documentation while monitoring developments through ground operations, communication approached the group with information that would escalate the situation even further. "Miss Mitchell," he said quietly, "I've received reports that Mr. Blackwood's social media posts have generated copycats. Other passengers on different airlines are filming minority customers and questioning their presence in premium cabins. This incident has triggered a broader pattern of discriminatory behavior." The revelation transformed a single passenger dispute into an industry-wide crisis that would require coordination with federal transportation authorities, civil rights organizations, and competitive airlines to address effectively. Margaret Thornfield, whose investment banking background had taught her to recognize crucial moments, realized that she had witnessed something that would be studied in business schools and civil rights law courses for decades to come. "Zara," she said, using her first name deliberately, "I work in corporate finance, and I want you to know that what happened today represents more than passenger discrimination. It represents a fundamental failure of business culture that prioritizes assumptions over evidence." Dr. Wesley, who had remained largely silent since the revelation of Zara's identity, finally spoke with the gravity of someone who had lived through the civil rights era and recognized historical significance when he witnessed it. "Young lady," he said formally, "I want to personally apologize for not intervening more forcefully when Mr. Blackwood began his attack. I had the privilege of witnessing discrimination without experiencing it personally, which meant I had the responsibility to speak up more clearly." The apology carried weight because it acknowledged not just what had happened, but what could have been prevented if bystanders had accepted responsibility for intervening in discrimination when they witnessed it. Jonathan Blackwood, who had been listening to these conversations while scrolling through increasingly hostile social media responses, finally understood that his situation extended far beyond a single incident of poor judgment. His business empire, built on personal branding and public credibility, was collapsing as corporate sponsors, business partners, and media outlets distanced themselves from the toxic association his name had acquired in less than 3 hours. Blackwood Business Hour had been canceled by the network pending legal review. His book publisher had suspended promotional activities. 3 major corporations had terminated consulting agreements. And his talent agency had issued a statement describing his behavior as inconsistent with our values and professional standards. Elena Santos, who had been receiving real-time updates from corporate headquarters throughout the deplaning process, approached Zara with news that would determine how the crisis resolution would proceed. "Miss Mitchell, we've identified the employee training gaps that enabled this incident. Customer service protocols prioritize VIP passengers without adequate safeguards for civil rights compliance. Staff receive minimal bias training, and supervisory oversight focuses on revenue generation rather than passenger dignity." The assessment was comprehensive and damning, acknowledging that Zara's experience represented predictable outcomes of flawed policies rather than isolated failures of individual judgment. But the most significant development was yet to come. As passengers from Flight 901 collected their luggage and departed the gate area, Zara received a phone call that would transform her personal experience into a catalyst for industry-wide reform. "Miss Mitchell, this is Congressman David Martinez from the House Transportation Committee. We've been monitoring the social media coverage of your experience, and we'd like to invite you to testify at hearings we're convening next month about discrimination in commercial aviation." The invitation represented an opportunity to address passenger discrimination at the federal level, using her platform and experience to implement changes that would protect travelers across all airlines, not just Elite Airways. As Zara considered the congressman's invitation, Jonathan Blackwood was dealing with consequences that extended far beyond social media embarrassment or canceled speaking engagements. His investment firm's major clients were demanding meetings to discuss reputation risks. His television appearances were being suspended indefinitely. His social media accounts were hemorrhaging followers as corporate partners and individual supporters abandoned him in real time. Margaret Thornfield, who understood how quickly business relationships could dissolve during reputation crises, offered advice that Blackwood was no longer in a position to ignore. "Jonathan," she said bluntly, "you have maybe 48 hours to issue a genuine apology, accept full responsibility for your behavior, and demonstrate actual understanding of why your actions were wrong. Otherwise, your career is over permanently." But Blackwood's problems extended beyond public relations management. Legal experts were analyzing his social media posts for potential civil rights violations. Employment lawyers were advising former business partners about liability exposure, and corporate investigators were reviewing his past behavior for patterns of discrimination that could generate additional lawsuits. Sophia Martinez, whose 6-year career with Elite Airways had been defined by consistently positive performance reviews and customer service commendations, received news that would validate Zara's earlier assessment of the situation. Sophia Elena Santos said privately, "The review committee has determined that your response to today's incident was appropriate, given inadequate training and conflicting policy guidance. You're being recommended for promotion to senior flight attendant with additional responsibilities for bias prevention training." The promotion recognized that Sophia had been placed in an impossible situation between competing corporate priorities, and it acknowledged that individual employees couldn't be held responsible for widespread policy failures that enabled discrimination. As the immediate crisis response continued, Zara Mitchell was already planning the long-term reforms that would transform Elite Airways from a company that accommodated discrimination into a leader in civil rights compliance and passenger dignity. The changes she was about to implement would reshape not just Elite Airways, but the entire commercial aviation industry's approach to treating passengers with respect, regardless of their appearance age or perceived economic status. Jonathan Blackwood's 30 minutes of poor judgment had triggered reforms that would protect millions of travelers for decades to come. But first, Zara had to decide how to use her experience to ensure that no other passenger would face the humiliation she had endured in first class today. 3 months after Flight 901, Zara Mitchell stood before the House Transportation Committee in Washington, D.C., not as a victim seeking justice, but as a business leader offering solutions to prevent future discrimination in commercial aviation. Her testimony would reshape federal transportation policy and establish new standards for passenger rights across the entire airline industry. "Congressman Martinez," she said, addressing the committee chair directly, "what happened to me was wrong, but it wasn't surprising. For 18 months before that incident, I documented dozens of cases where minority passengers were treated differently than white passengers, where assumptions about wealth and status led to unequal service, where company policies were applied selectively based on appearance." Her testimony included specific recommendations that became known as the Mitchell Standards Mandatory Bias Training for all airline employees, federal oversight of passenger discrimination complaints, and financial penalties for airlines that failed to protect civil rights. Within 6 months, every major airline in America had implemented these standards, transforming how millions of travelers were treated. Elite Airways became the industry leader in passenger rights protection, not because of legal requirements, but because Zara used her ownership authority to implement changes that went far beyond federal minimums. Customer satisfaction scores reached record highs as employees learned to see passengers as individuals deserving respect rather than revenue sources requiring evaluation. Sofia Martinez, promoted to Director of Passenger Experience, developed training programs that were adopted by airlines worldwide. Her work focused on empowering employees to intervene when they witness discrimination, providing clear protocols for protecting passenger dignity while maintaining operational efficiency. The most important lesson Sofia often told new employees is that treating people with respect isn't about their bank account or their clothes or their age. It's about recognizing their humanity and their right to be treated fairly regardless of who they appear to be. Captain Rodriguez became an advocate for civil rights training throughout the aviation industry, speaking at conferences about the leadership responsibility to create cultures where discrimination couldn't flourish. His experience on Flight 901 taught him that neutrality in the face of injustice was actually complicity, and that authority carried the obligation to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Dr. Wesley and Margaret Thornfield remained in contact with Zara, joining a network of business leaders committed to addressing bias in corporate environments. Their experience as witnesses to discrimination taught them that privilege came with the responsibility to speak up when others were being treated unfairly, even when intervention felt uncomfortable or risky. But the most dramatic transformation belonged to Jonathan Blackwood, whose life changed in ways that nobody could have predicted. The immediate aftermath of Flight 901 was devastating. Blackwood Business Hour was permanently canceled. His investment firm lost 80% of its clients within 6 months. Speaking engagements, book deals, and corporate partnerships evaporated as his brand became synonymous with documented discrimination and poor judgment. For 18 months, Blackwood disappeared from public life entirely. He sold his investment firm, liquidated most of his assets, and enrolled in graduate courses focused on social psychology and unconscious bias. The experience of having his assumptions proven catastrophically wrong had forced him to confront beliefs and behaviors he had never examined. When he returned to public speaking, it was with a completely different message. Instead of promoting business success through dominance and assumption, he talked about the personal and professional costs of bias, the importance of questioning first impressions, and the responsibility successful people had to examine their own prejudices. "I built my entire career on reading people correctly," he told audiences at diversity conferences and corporate training events. "But I was only reading people who looked like me, thought like me, and came from backgrounds I understood. When I encountered someone outside those narrow categories, my assumptions weren't just wrong. They were destructive." His new career focused on helping business leaders recognize and address their own biases before those biases destroyed relationships, opportunities, and reputations. While he never regained his previous level of wealth or influence, his willingness to acknowledge his mistakes and learn from them created a different kind of success, one built on helping others avoid the errors that had cost him everything. Zara Mitchell, meanwhile, used her experience to transform Elite Airways into a model for corporate social responsibility in transportation. Under her leadership, the company became the first airline to achieve perfect scores on federal civil rights compliance audits, the first to implement passenger advocacy programs, and the first to establish scholarship funds specifically for students from underrepresented communities pursuing careers in aviation. Her approach to business leadership emphasized that true success meant creating value for all stakeholders, not just shareholders. Elite Airways' profitability actually increased as the company's reputation for treating passengers with dignity attracted customers who valued respect over luxury amenities. "Ownership isn't about having the power to exclude people," she often said in interviews about corporate governance and social responsibility. "It's about having the responsibility to include everyone and treat them with the dignity they deserve." The legacy of Flight 901 extended far beyond Elite Airways or even the airline industry. Business schools began teaching case studies about bias in customer service. Civil rights organizations used the incident to advocate for stronger discrimination protections. And millions of social media users learned about the dangers of making assumptions based on appearance. Most importantly, passengers across America began flying with greater confidence that their rights would be protected regardless of their race, age, or appearance. The changes Zara implemented at Elite Airways became industry standards that protected travelers who couldn't defend themselves the way a billionaire owner could. On the 2-year anniversary of Flight 901, Zara was flying Elite Airways again, this time in coach, continuing her practice of evaluating customer service from the passenger perspective. The young Hispanic man sitting beside her was flying for the first time, nervous about the experience and uncertain about airline protocols. When he was served his meal with the same courtesy and attention as first-class passengers, when his questions were answered patiently by flight attendants who saw him as a valued customer, rather than an economic category, when he deplaned with positive memories of respectful treatment. Zara knew that the changes she had implemented were working. True ownership, she had learned, isn't about having your name on the door. It's about making sure everyone feels welcome to walk through it. The flight attendant on that anniversary flight was Sofia Martinez, now a director, but still working flights to stay connected with frontline passenger service. As they prepared for landing, Sophia approached Zara's seat with a smile that carried 2 years of professional growth and personal understanding. "Miss Mitchell," she said quietly, "thank you for showing us that treating people with dignity isn't about their status or spending. It's about recognizing their humanity." Zara looked around the cabin at the passengers of all backgrounds being treated with equal respect and courtesy, regardless of their clothes, their age, or their apparent wealth. The changes that began with 30 minutes of discrimination in first class had protected millions of travelers and transformed an entire industry's approach to customer service. That transformation was Jonathan Blackwood's legacy too, though he experienced it as consequence rather than achievement. His willingness to acknowledge his mistakes and learn from them had helped countless business leaders recognize and address their own biases before those biases destroyed careers and relationships. If stories like this inspire you to speak up when you witness discrimination, to examine your own assumptions about others, and to use whatever privilege you have to protect those who need protection, then make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it, because sometimes the most important changes begin with one person refusing to accept injustice, even when that injustice seems normal to everyone else around them. Hit that notification bell so you never miss stories that matter. Drop a comment about a time when you witnessed or experienced discrimination, and let's build a community that stands up for dignity and respect for everyone. Because true leadership isn't about having power over others. It's about using whatever influence you have to make sure everyone is treated with the respect they deserve, regardless of how they look, where they come from, or what assumptions others make about their place in the world. Remember, dignity isn't a luxury that some passengers deserve more than others. It's a right that belongs to everyone, and stories like Zara's remind us that sometimes the most powerful changes happen when someone with real authority chooses to use it not for personal gain but for justice that protects us all.